Hey, good afternoon. It's Monday, and I am recording this little video just to talk a little bit about the 1960s, and particularly some of the popular culture elements that go into the 60s and whatnot. Please, if you're watching this and you're studying with this video, please make sure that you actually look up the songs that I'm talking about, the TV shows and such. And, don't just use my 30-second blip, but go a little bit beyond that so that you can get a sense of kind of what was going on. Let's start. We're talking about the 1960s. Let's start with, sort of what was the counterculture? What was the revolution? What was the change? The first part of it goes back into the 50s, right? You have the birth of rock and roll. And when I say rock and roll, a lot of people have a vision of the Beastie Boys, Guns N' Roses, Metallica, something like that. You got to wipe that because that comes much later. In the early years, rock and roll was a fusion of country and blues. It was essentially using, country chord progressions and the blues scale and putting that together into one, sort of big picture. What does that mean for the average listener who's not a musician? What it means is that there is a dissonance. Country music is based on major scales and major chords. Blues uses a minor scale as its as its main scale. And so when you're playing a minor scale against a major chord progression, there are going to be certain notes from that scale that are just not going to fit. And in classical music, we just said, well, that's bad. We don't like that. We're going to scratch that, and we're just going to use major chords, major scales. They match up. In this case, we're going to use major chords, minor scales, and they're not going to match up perfectly. But instead of saying that that tension is wrong or is a problem, we're going to say that tension sounds cool. That's what makes it rock and roll. This tension, this dissonance. And if you want probably the best example of something like that, the first thing I'd say would just be go listen to any blues album. But the sort of easiest place to see it for most people, if you're not a musician and you're not clear on what I'm talking about, is actually to go a little bit past the 1960s and look up the song Back in Black by AC/DC. And that opening chord riff, da 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 da, that thing, and God forgive my voice, but that thing is minor scale against major chords. And that's why it sounds so wicked. That's why it sounds so evil. That's why it sounds so dirty. It just kind of doesn't sound right. But to someone who's grown up listening to rock and roll, it does sound right. It just sounds, like rock and roll. So if you're looking for the sort of clearest, easiest example of it, that's where I tell students to go. If you really want to hear that sort of minor scale against a major chord, listen to the opening couple bars of Back in Black. Really listen to most of AC/DC because they are the world's simplest band. They pretty much play 3 chords and they're major chords, and then they play minor scales against them, and they just use lots of overdrive and play really loud. And so they're AC/DC. Great. But for this exercise, what I would encourage you to do, go listen to some 60s music. And I would encourage you to take some time and just go listen to some 60s music. Go to YouTube, put in 60s music playlist. And you know what you're going to find? You're going to find a lot of music that is not particularly radical. You're going to find California Dreamin'. You're going to find Sloop Johnny B. You're going to find, wouldn't it be nice if we were older? A beautiful song about, there's two people, wouldn't it be nice if they were older and then they could get married and they could live together because you didn't live together until you were married, So there's this, innocence that's present in the 60s. Something we got to remember is that the sort of radical hippie counterculture was a minority. It was a small minority, a vocal one, but a small one. Most people were not out there with their long hair and their acoustic guitars playing Bob Dylan music, protesting, burning draft cards and bras. Most people weren't doing that, okay? So don't think of the 60s as the decade of the hippies. I know it's tempting, but don't think of it that way. Instead, think of it as the decade of the tension between sort of the hippies and the straights, the hippies and the normals, whatever you want to think of it as. But the, quote, normals, were far larger. Up until the very end of the decade, support for Vietnam was remarkably high. People were incredibly okay with the Vietnam War. People weren't radically opposed to that conflict. And so it is worth keeping that in the back of our heads, that even though we often have this image of Vietnam as this thing that every American hated somehow, it's not the way it was, right? A lot of people supported the fight against communism. But we're going to talk about hippies a little bit, and we're going to talk about music. And I'm going to make this a real short video. I want you to look up a couple of songs. First of all, look up a song called Fortunate Son. Fortunate Son. I believe it's Creedence Clearwater Revival. Look up Blowing in the Wind. A bunch of people did that song. Mamas and Papas did it. Bob Dylan sang it. There's a bunch of people. Look that song up. Look up Times Are A-Changin' by Bob Dylan. Look up All Along the Watchtower, Jimi Hendrix. Look up Purple Haze, Jimi Hendrix. Look up I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. Right? Those are all good places to start. Other good places will be to look up Buffalo Springfield and just listen to a variety of Buffalo Springfield music, and you'll find a lot of anti-Vietnam sentiment there. But definitely listen to these songs, listen to this sort of anti-Vietnam music, and get a sense of kind of what was going on in the hearts and minds of at least some of the people during the Vietnam years. The struggle that some people had with the war. And we'll go forward, from there. I would encourage you, once you've listened to an assortment of sort of 60s Vietnam music, look up Neil Young's song, Ohio. Look up Bruce Springsteen's song, Born in the USA. Look up Billy Joel's song, We Didn't Start the Fire, but also Billy Joel's absolute classic, Goodnight Saigon. Right? These are all sort of classic anti-war songs. And the later music, the Billy Joel, the Bruce Springsteen and whatnot, these are songs that are written years later by people who are remembering Vietnam. And that's also something that we're going to talk about, is sort of how we remember Vietnam. Also, remember that in the midst of all this, even though I'm focusing heavily on Vietnam, a lot of the same protest music that was used against Vietnam was used as protest music in the civil rights movement and in the feminist movement. There was a tremendous overlap in these movements, and it's part of what made them so strong, was that there was, a lot of coalition building where people were, maybe their passion was to oppose the war, but they'd be out there for the civil rights stuff because they saw equality as leading to peace. And so they saw it as something worth doing. And likewise, there were a lot of people who saw peace leading to equality. And so they would support the anti-war movement, even though that wasn't really their pet project, because they supported women's rights or the rights of racial minorities, those kinds of things, whatever. All right, so listen to some music. Give it some thought. Look at the lyrics. I mean, as fun as the music is, look at the lyrics. Ask yourself, with like Fortunate Son, what's being gotten at here? And we'll talk about that stuff then again, okay? So y'all take it easy. Have a good one. I'll catch up with you next time. Bye-bye.